They said a dog forgets the moment the uniform comes off, that memory fades once the mission ends, and loyalty dissolves with time, but no one told Rex that because Rex never stopped waiting. 2 years after his final deployment, the retired German Shepherd sat at the edge of an abandoned military gate where the wind moved dust like ghosts across cracked pavement, his eyes locked on a horizon that no one else bothered to look at anymore. The base had grown quieter each month, voices replaced by machinery, then silence, then nothing at all, yet Rex remained exactly where Captain Ethan Walker used to call his name. The humans around him had changed shifts, changed assignments, changed lives, and eventually changed expectations, until they started calling him just a retired K9, as if service could be erased like chalk from a board. But Rex still reacted to the sound of boots the same way he had in the field, still lifted his head when engines idled too long at the wrong distance, still turned toward the wind as if it carried orders only he could hear. On this morning, the sky was low and pale, the kind of gray that pressed gently against the world without ever breaking it, and Rex was sitting in his usual place when a convoy rolled through the outer perimeter. Nothing about it should have mattered to him, not anymore, but something inside him tightened instantly, as if a memory had just been spoken aloud in a language he never forgot. His ears rose, his posture shifted, and for the first time in months, he stood without hesitation. The handlers nearby barely noticed at first, until Rex began walking, then trotting, then breaking into a steady run that cut across the yard with a focus that didn't belong to anything retired. He moved past familiar fences, past the training field where commands used to echo, past the storage units where old gear collected dust, and for a moment it felt less like escape and more like purpose returning. No one called after him fast enough to matter, because Rex wasn't running away from something, he was running towards something he had never stopped belonging to. The scent was faint at first, buried under years of distance and change, but it existed the way truth exists even when no one is looking for it. It pulled him beyond the base lines, toward a forgotten maintenance road that curved into wooded terrain, where sunlight broke through branches in uneven strips. Rex slowed only once, just long enough to steady himself, before continuing forward with a focus that erased everything behind him. And then, as if the world had been holding its breath for exactly this moment, he stopped at something half buried near an old checkpoint marker. It was small, worn, but unmistakable. A metal tag, scratched at the edges, carrying a name that didn't belong in the past, Ethan Walker. Rex didn't move for several seconds, as if waiting for the ground itself to confirm what his senses already knew, and then he let out a low sound that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with recognition, before turning his body toward the deeper path ahead, because somewhere beyond what he could see, the voice he remembered was still out there waiting to be found. The metal tag felt heavier in Rex's presence than it should have, as if memory itself had weight, and for a moment he simply stood still on the edge of the forgotten maintenance road with his gaze locked on the name etched into it. The wind moved through the trees in slow waves, carrying distant echoes of a world that no longer cared about old missions or retired service records, yet something inside Rex refused to accept silence as an answer. He lowered his head once, steady and controlled, then moved forward again, following a scent that was no longer just chemical or physical, but something deeper, something built from repetition, trust, and shared survival in places where daylight rarely mattered. Each step took him farther from anything familiar, past overgrown markers and faded warning signs, until the forest thinned and revealed a structure partially hidden by time and neglect. It was not a battlefield, not a zone of conflict, but something quieter and stranger, a facility that seemed abandoned on the surface yet carried faint signs of recent presence, like footprints pressed into soft ground that had not yet been claimed by nature. Rex paused at the edge of the clearing, his body tense but not fearful, listening to a rhythm only he could interpret. Somewhere inside, a door shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. His ears rotated instantly toward the sound, locking onto it with absolute precision. He moved closer, step by step, until he reached a partially open entry point where light spilled unevenly across the floor. Inside, the air was still, sterile, and filled with the faint hum of machines that suggested monitoring rather than conflict. Rex hesitated only once before crossing the threshold. His paws made no sound on the smooth surface as he entered, following instinct deeper into the structure until the hallway opened into a dimly lit room lined with medical equipment and quiet displays. There, seated near a narrow bed with his shoulders slightly forward as if holding himself together through sheer discipline, was a man who looked both familiar and changed at the same time. Ethan Walker's face carried exhaustion that no field training had prepared him for, but when his eyes lifted, something inside them shifted immediately, as if recognition had been waiting beneath everything else. For a brief moment, neither moved, as though time itself needed permission to continue. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low, uncertain, but unmistakably real, and Rex responded before thought could intervene, closing the distance between them with a steady urgency that broke every boundary of procedure and protocol he had ever known. Ethan's hand lifted instinctively, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before resting against Rex's head, fingers trembling slightly as if confirming something he had stopped allowing himself to believe. The room felt smaller in that instant, not because of walls or space, but because everything else had fallen away, leaving only recognition, breath, and the fragile certainty that something thought-lost had found its way back. Ethan exhaled slowly, his forehead lowering until it nearly touched Rex, and when he finally spoke again, his words carried a weight that suggested long nights of silence and unanswered questions. Before anything else could be said, a distant sound echoed through the structure, subtle at first, then clearer, as if the world outside had just remembered they were there, and Rex turned his head toward it instantly, not with fear, but with the same unwavering focus that had once carried him through every mission he was trained to survive. The sound grew clearer as Rex held his position at the threshold of the dim corridor, his body angled toward the direction of the distant echo as if the entire facility had just shifted its attention in response to something unseen. Ethan's hand remained resting against him for a brief moment longer before slowly lifting away, his fingers lingering in the air as though reluctant to break contact with a reality he had not allowed himself to trust until now. His breathing was controlled but uneven, the kind of discipline built over years of service struggling to contain something deeper that surfaced only in moments of recognition. Rex stayed close, not moving far, but his focus was no longer divided. Every subtle change in the environment mattered now, every distant vibration in the floor, every faint mechanical hum that suggested movement beyond the room they were in. Ethan's eyes shifted toward the corridor entrance, and in that silence between them, understanding passed without words, shaped by years of shared instinct rather than conversation. Somewhere deeper inside the structure, lights shifted from steady white to a muted amber, signaling a change in system status that neither of them needed to be trained to interpret. The facility was no longer still. It was awake. Ethan slowly pushed himself upright, steadying his posture against the edge of the narrow bed as he scanned the room with a measured calm that did not match the tension in the air. Rex mirrored the shift instantly, stepping half a pace forward, placing himself between Ethan and the corridor without hesitation, not out of fear but out of purpose. The bond between them did not require commands to activate. It responded to presence, to recognition, to the simple fact that one had found the other again after a separation that should not have been survivable. A faint sound echoed again, closer this time, not loud, but deliberate, like controlled movement through structured space. Ethan turned his head slightly, listening, his expression tightening in focus rather than panic. Whatever this place had been used for, it was not abandoned as it first appeared. It was paused, watched, waiting for something to be resolved. Rex's stance lowered slightly, not aggressive, but alert, every muscle aligned with precision, his attention dividing between Ethan and the corridor in equal measure. Ethan reached slowly toward a small console near the wall, hesitating before touching it, as though unsure whether interacting with it would confirm or disrupt what they were experiencing. The screen flickered faintly, displaying fragments of system data and location indicators that shifted too quickly to fully stabilize. Rex glanced at it only briefly before returning his focus forward, because what mattered more than data was movement, and movement was now undeniable. Another sound followed, softer but closer, and this time Ethan did not look away from the corridor. Instead, he spoke quietly, not as an order but as recognition of reality returning piece by piece. Rex did not respond verbally, but his presence shifted slightly forward again, anchoring the space between Ethan and whatever was approaching, as the facility around them seemed to narrow into a single unavoidable truth that something had found them, or perhaps had never stopped searching in the first place. The corridor seemed longer now, not because its physical length had changed, but because every step of silence inside it carried weight, as if the facility itself was holding its breath alongside them. Rex remained slightly ahead of Ethan, his body aligned with precision, not rushing, not hesitating, but reading every shift in the environment with a focus that went beyond instinct and into something closer to understanding. Ethan followed a half-step behind, his hand occasionally brushing the wall for balance, his movements careful but no longer uncertain, as though the presence of Rex had anchored him back into a version of himself that had not existed since before his disappearance. The faint sound they had heard earlier returned again, closer now, and this time it carried a pattern, not random movement but deliberate pacing, like someone moving with awareness of space and timing. Rex stopped at the next intersection where two corridors split in opposite directions, his head turning slowly from left to right, weighing information that could not be seen but was clearly being processed. Ethan stepped beside him, lowering his voice as if the building itself might respond to volume, and for a brief moment they both listened to the same silence, but interpreted it differently. Then Rex shifted toward the right corridor without hesitation, as though something unspoken had confirmed the direction. Ethan did not question it. He simply followed. The lighting above them flickered slightly as they advanced, not breaking completely, but adjusting in subtle intervals that suggested a system still active behind layers of inactivity. Small details began to emerge in the environment, faint marks along the walls where equipment had once been moved, clean sections of floor that contrasted with untouched dust, and occasional indicators that someone had passed through recently with purpose rather than abandonment. Rex slowed near a partially open security door, pausing long enough to assess the space beyond it. Ethan looked past him into the room, seeing rows of inactive monitors and chairs arranged in a semicircular pattern, as if this space had once been used for coordination or observation. Nothing moved inside, yet the air felt different here, less empty, more contained. Rex entered first, stepping across the threshold with controlled confidence, his attention immediately drawn toward a secondary exit at the far end of the room. Ethan followed, scanning the consoles as he passed, noticing faint residual activity on one of the screens that still displayed shifting data logs too fragmented to interpret fully. The presence they had been sensing earlier was no longer distant. It was now part of the same structure they were standing in. A soft mechanical tone activated somewhere deeper within the facility, not an alarm, not an alert, but a confirmation of access, followed by a quiet unlocking sound that echoed through unseen doors. Rex turned toward the far exit instantly, his posture tightening slightly, not in fear, but in recognition that the path ahead had just been acknowledged by something other than them. Ethan stopped beside him for a brief moment, placing a steady hand near Rex's shoulder, not to restrain him, but to match his focus. They both understood without words that what came next was no longer about searching. It was about what had already been waiting for them to arrive. The unlocked sound lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if the facility itself was acknowledging their decision to move forward, and Rex responded immediately by stepping toward the far exit with controlled urgency, his body aligned with purpose that no longer required instruction. Ethan followed closely behind, his hand briefly brushing the edge of the console they had just passed, but his attention was no longer on the data or the fragmented screens. It was on Rex, and on the direction they were both now choosing without hesitation. The corridor beyond the security door was narrower, colder, and noticeably less maintained, with subtle changes in temperature that suggested ventilation systems working in uneven cycles. Rex slowed slightly, not because of uncertainty, but because the environment ahead carried a different kind of presence, one that required closer attention. Ethan noticed it too, his steps becoming quieter, more deliberate, as though instinctively matching the rhythm of movement that Rex had set. A faint vibration traveled through the floor, barely perceptible, but enough to confirm that deeper systems were still active within the structure. Rex stopped again at a junction where the corridor split into three directions, each marked by faded symbols that no longer carried clear meaning. He turned his head slowly, scanning, listening, absorbing information that could not be translated into human terms but was clearly understood in his own way. Ethan waited without speaking, allowing the silence to stretch, trusting a judgment that had already proven itself since the moment they reunited. Then Rex chose the center path and continued forward. The lighting here was dimmer, spaced further apart, casting longer shadows that shifted slightly as they moved. Ethan's breathing remained steady, but there was a growing awareness in his posture, a recognition that whatever they were approaching was no longer passive. It was aware of them as well. Rex paused near a reinforced door that was partially ajar, its edges marked by faint scratches and mechanical wear that suggested repeated access over time. He did not enter immediately. Instead, he stood still, listening to something beyond the threshold. Ethan approached slowly, placing himself just behind Rex's shoulder line, and looked into the space beyond. The room was larger than the previous ones, filled with structural supports and dormant monitoring equipment, arranged in a way that suggested observation rather than confinement. There was a single illuminated panel still active on the far wall, casting a soft glow across the center of the space. Rex stepped inside first, his movement careful but confident, and immediately oriented toward the far side where another exit was visible, partially concealed by shadow. Ethan followed, his eyes scanning the room for details that did not immediately align with abandonment. Clean lines near the floor suggested recent passage, and the faint hum of power distribution indicated that systems here were still being maintained at a minimal level. As they crossed the midpoint of the room, the illuminated panel flickered once, then stabilized, as if registering their presence in real time. Rex stopped beneath it, looking upward briefly, then shifting his attention back toward the far exit. Ethan felt it then, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like a mechanism preparing to respond to proximity. Without warning, a soft mechanical tone echoed through the space, followed by a controlled unlocking sequence deeper within the facility, confirming that another barrier had just been released somewhere ahead. Rex reacted instantly, not with surprise, but with readiness, stepping forward with renewed focus. Ethan matched his movement without hesitation, and for the first time since entering the structure, neither of them paused to analyze what might come next, because both understood that they were no longer being guided by uncertainty. They were being directed towards something that had already been waiting for their arrival. The corridor ahead opened into a wider passage where the lighting shifted again, no longer flickering or dim, but steady in a controlled way that suggested full system awareness returning the deeper they went, and Rex continued forward without hesitation as if he could feel a destination forming long before it could be seen. Ethan stayed close behind, his attention no longer divided between caution and curiosity, but fully anchored in the quiet certainty that every step was leading them closer to something that had remained hidden for a long time. The air here felt different, more regulated, as though the facility had reached a zone that was actively maintained rather than forgotten, and faint indicators along the walls began to glow in soft intervals, marking distance and direction without words. Rex slowed at the next intersection where a sealed observation window overlooked another corridor below, and he stepped toward it with deliberate focus. Ethan joined him and looked down through the glass, seeing a lower level illuminated in a soft white tone, where structural pathways extended in multiple directions like a controlled network. Nothing moved at first, yet the stillness did not feel empty. It felt observed. Rex remained fixed on one point in the distance, his posture slightly lowered, as though confirming a recognition that could not be translated into human understanding. Then, without warning, a subtle activation sound echoed through the facility, not loud, but precise, and the lighting along the lower level shifted in sequence, one section at a time, revealing a path that had just become accessible. Ethan's gaze followed the change carefully, noticing that the system was not reacting randomly but responding in a structured pattern, as if guiding rather than resisting their presence. Rex turned away from the observation window and moved toward a descending access point where a narrow stairway led downward. Ethan followed, his steps steady but increasingly aware that the deeper they went, the more intentional the environment felt. The stairway was clean, maintained, and free of any signs of neglect, which stood in sharp contrast to the upper levels they had passed earlier. As they descended, the soundscape shifted subtly, replacing mechanical hums with quieter, more contained rhythms, like systems operating in standby mode rather than full activation. Rex paused once midway down, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something that had no physical source. Ethan stopped behind him, allowing the silence to stretch again, and in that moment the facility responded once more. A soft illumination sequence activated below, revealing the base of the stairs and a wide corridor extending forward with doors aligned at precise intervals. Rex resumed movement immediately, guiding them forward into the lower level where the architecture felt more intentional, more central, as though this section held the core purpose of the entire structure. Ethan's focus sharpened as they advanced, noticing that several doors bore inactive identifiers that had recently been reactivated, their panels faintly glowing with updated status indicators. Rex stopped at one of the doors without hesitation, his presence unwavering, as if something behind it had already acknowledged him long before they arrived. Ethan stepped closer, placing his attention on the subtle light surrounding the frame, and for a brief moment there was only silence, deep and controlled, until a final mechanical confirmation echoed through the corridor, signaling that access had been granted ahead. Rex remained still, not moving forward yet, but clearly aware that whatever lay beyond was no longer just a search or a signal. It was a response. The sealed door stood at the end of the corridor like a final boundary between what had been known and what was still hidden, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a faint line of light tracing its edges, as if the system on the other side had already recognized their presence. Rex remained perfectly still in front of it, his focus absolute, his posture steady in a way that suggested complete certainty without explanation, while Ethan approached from behind with slower steps, his attention fixed on the subtle illumination that pulsed once along the frame before stabilizing again. The silence between them felt different here, not empty, but concentrated, as though the entire facility had narrowed its attention into this single point. Rex lifted his head slightly, then placed one step forward, and at that exact moment the door responded with a soft mechanical release that echoed through the corridor without urgency or resistance. The panel slid open smoothly, revealing a dimly lit interior space that was larger than expected, structured with controlled symmetry and minimal design, as if this room had been preserved rather than abandoned. Ethan stepped closer behind Rex, scanning the space carefully, noticing that the lighting inside was steadier than any level they had passed before, with a quiet hum that suggested full operational stability. Rex entered first without hesitation, his movement slow but intentional, crossing the threshold as though confirming something he had already understood long before the door opened. Ethan followed, and the moment they were both inside, the door sealed quietly behind them without sound of force, only completion. The room stretched forward into a central observation area, surrounded by glass partitions that overlooked adjacent sections of the facility, all aligned in precise geometric order. There were no signs of disorder, no indications of emergency, only structured silence and active systems running at minimal output. Rex moved toward the center of the room and stopped, his attention fixed on a point beyond the glass where a softly illuminated chamber could be seen in the distance. Ethan followed his gaze and felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if recognition was forming before confirmation. Then, from somewhere within the deeper section of the facility, a secondary light sequence activated, revealing movement behind the glass that was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably aware of their presence. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his breathing steady but focused, as Rex lowered his stance. Just enough to signal readiness rather than tension. The figure behind the glass remained partially obscured, but its presence was no longer uncertain. It was real, and it was responding. A soft system tone echoed through the room, followed by a structured activation pattern across multiple panels, confirming full engagement of the central unit. Rex did not move, but his focus intensified, locked onto the chamber beyond as if every sense he had ever developed was converging at once. Ethan stood beside him now, no longer behind, both of them facing forward as the final layer of separation between them and what they had been searching for began to dissolve, not with force, but with recognition that something long dormant had finally been reached. The final barrier did not open like the others. Instead, The entire observation chamber seemed to respond as if it had been waiting for a specific moment that could not be rushed, and the glass wall in front of Ethan and Rex slowly adjusted its opacity, revealing the space beyond with increasing clarity rather than force. Rex stepped forward first, his movement calm but absolute, crossing into the center of the observation platform without hesitation, while Ethan followed closely, his attention locked forward as the last layer of visual distortion faded completely. Inside the chamber, the lighting was soft and balanced, casting no harsh shadows, only a steady illumination that made everything feel suspended in time. At the far end of the room, behind a secondary transparent partition, a figure stood still, partially turned away, as if aware of being observed but not yet fully reacting. Rex stopped immediately, his entire focus narrowing to a single point, his posture shifting in a way that removed all uncertainty. Ethan felt it before he understood it, a quiet tension that was not fear, but recognition forming at the edge of memory. The figure slowly turned, and the movement was controlled, deliberate, as though every second had been measured before it was allowed to happen. As the face came into view, Ethan's breath steadied in a way that contradicted everything around him, because what he was seeing did not belong to absence or memory, but to presence. Captain Ethan Walker stood on the other side of the glass, not as a projection, not as a recording, but as a living return from a silence that had lasted too long to be explained quickly. For a moment, neither side moved. Rex remained completely still, his gaze locked forward, his body aligned with a focus that carried no confusion, only confirmation. Ethan stepped closer to the glass, placing one hand against it without pressure, as if trying to bridge something that did not require force to be crossed. The man on the other side looked at him directly, and in that shared silence, understanding passed without words, shaped by years that had not erased recognition. A soft system tone activated across the chamber, signaling full stabilization of the central unit, but it was no longer important in that moment. Rex shifted slightly forward, then stopped again, as if respecting a boundary that had finally been restored rather than broken. Ethan's expression changed subtly, not with shock, but with the kind of stillness that follows something deeply personal returning after being lost. The glass between them reflected faint overlays of system data, but none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was presence, acknowledgement, and the quiet confirmation that what had been searched for had not disappeared, only remained out of reach until now. The chamber light stabilized into a steady glow, and for the first time since entering the facility, there was no sense of pursuit or uncertainty, only arrival. The silence inside the chamber felt different now, no longer heavy with uncertainty but softened into something closer to understanding, as if the entire facility had finally completed the purpose it had been building toward for a long time. Ethan Walker stood behind the glass barrier for a few seconds longer, his hand still resting lightly against the surface, before the separation between him and the observation platform began to shift. The transparent partition did not shatter or open dramatically. Instead, it slowly dissolved its opacity, layer by layer, until it became nothing more than an open passage that no longer required permission to cross. Rex moved first without hesitation, crossing the final boundary with a calm certainty that came not from training but from recognition, and Ethan followed immediately after, stepping forward into the same space as if time itself had decided to stop holding them apart. When they finally stood within arm's reach, there was no need for commands or explanation, only the quiet weight of everything that had been endured before this moment. Ethan lowered himself slightly, his movements careful, as though afraid that any sudden action might break the fragile reality in front of him, and Rex responded by closing the remaining distance, pressing forward with steady assurance until there was no space left between them. The contact was simple, grounding, and absolute, carrying more meaning than any system or mission could ever define. Ethan exhaled slowly, his forehead lowering until it rested gently against Rex, and in that stillness, years of separation seemed to compress into something small enough to understand. The facility around them remained active, but its presence faded into background noise, no longer important in the face of what had already been restored. After a long moment, Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and steady, not as an order, but as acknowledgement of something that had survived beyond expectation. Rex did not respond in words, but his presence shifted slightly closer, as if confirming everything that needed to be said without language. A soft system tone echoed once through the chamber, signaling full disengagement of the containment sequence, followed by a gradual stabilization of ambient systems that now served no purpose other than closure. Ethan slowly straightened, keeping one hand on Rex's shoulder, and looked around the room with a clarity that suggested he was no longer seeing a facility, but a path that had brought him back to something essential. Rex turned his head briefly toward the exit, then back to Ethan, as if offering direction without instruction, and Ethan understood immediately. Together they began to move forward, not with urgency, but with balance, leaving behind the sterile structure that had held them apart for too long. As they reached the outer corridor, the lighting shifted one final time, no longer reactive or controlled, but steady and natural, as though the system had finally settled into rest. Ethan glanced once more at Rex, and for the first time since everything began, there was no search left in either of them, only continuation. They walked side by side toward the open path ahead, leaving the facility behind as it quietly powered down in the distance, and in that final movement, what had once been lost was no longer something to find, but something that had already returned.